Good morning and welcome back to our Family Citizen Science. And this week we are exploring everything related to dough and sourdough in particular, because that's something that most of us at the Discovery Center actually enjoy making in our own homes, but it's also kind of become a new thing that a lot of people are trying while they're at home because they want to restrict the number of times they go to a store and buy new supplies. And in some cases, maybe their store was out of bread, but they could get flour and make those things from scratch. And so I am going to talk about the science behind the bread today. And so first of all, I'm just going to start by talking about what makes bread turn into bread. And I'm going to show you some slides to do that. So hang on one second. I need to share my screen. So bread is kind of a really cool chemistry experiment because there are a whole lot of different molecules that are involved, but then also just kind of thinking about how those molecules interact with each other is what makes bread possible. And in reality, bread is just foam that we make stick and hold in place by baking it. And so bread is really made out of flour, water, yeast, and salt. You might choose to add additional flavoring or seasonings, but really those are the main ingredients. And Jan showed you her sourdough starter on Monday, and you saw kind of what happens with that yeast when it's eating those starches and it's producing gases. And Anne talked about different microbes that can be found in nature and in the soil. And yeast is also something that's found out in nature. But also the flour itself is made out of starches or carbohydrates, and those starches get broken down into sugars by the yeast because the yeast are using them for energy just like we do. And there's also proteins in the dough and additional types of molecules, but the proteins are basically what makes wheat flour, really useful for making bread. And one protein in particular is called gluten. And gluten is basically the protein that helps the dough stick together and to form kind of the matrix that makes the air pockets. So in this picture, you can kind of see that the blue lines basically represent those gluten molecules. So proteins are really long chain molecules. So if you imagine you had like a necklace with a bunch of beads on it, and when gluten comes in contact with water, well, actually the gluten is created in the dough when the proteins come in contact with water. And then they become these really long, sticky molecules. And as you knead the dough, you're actually helping stretch and elongate and open those molecules so that they can kind of stick together with other gluten molecules and form this matrix that traps those gas bubbles in the dough. And so in this picture, there's actually a comparison of dough that's made with wheat and dough that's made with rice flour, which would be gluten-free. So there's no gluten in this system. So gluten-free dough is a lot more tricky to make because it doesn't have the gluten in it. And what you end up having to do is instead of just kneading and smushing those gluten molecules together to form that matrix, you actually need to elongate the dough so that the starch granules they're also really long molecules, but you want them to kind of align with each other in nice straight lines. And the more you can get it to do that, the more likely it is to actually trap those gas bubbles versus if you just kneaded the dough like you would with wheat. So the process of making gluten-free dough versus wheat dough is actually really different. And the other big challenge is that gluten-free flours tend to need more water. And so they're stickier and they're harder to work with. And so there's different processes that you have to use. And so now I'm actually going to demonstrate some of that. So I'm going to leave my presentation and we'll come back to it in just a minute. And what I'd like to do is I have a dough can set up and I have a bunch of supplies on my counter. And so I'm going to demonstrate some of the things that you would observe in your kitchen if you were actually playing around with these doughs. So first of all, just to kind of refresh your memory, this is the yeast with the water and sugar, like Jan had talked about on Monday. And I do have sourdough starter in this jar right here. But since I use wheat flour for my sourdough starter, I didn't want to use that today to experiment with different types of flours, because then I would be introducing that wheat to my gluten-free flour, and that would kind of ruin my experiment. So this is just water and yeast that I bought at the store and some sugar to get it started. This is called proofing. So when you do this, you're basically just making sure that the yeast is alive and that it's actually eating the sugars and it's breathing out the carbon dioxide just like we do. And that's what this is actually, the foam you see here is a result of those gas bubbles getting trapped in this kind of gooey matrix of the yeast cells and water. And so that's what that foam is. And if this were in the dough, then you're basically, this is your goal, is you're looking for this kind of continuous gas production in order to get your dough to rise. And you'll notice that it just kind of collapsed on me because I shook the container, and that caused the bubbles to compress. So we've all experienced different types of foams in our lives. Like, for example, if you take a bubble bath and you have soap and water, and the water is coming out of the faucet and agitating the surface of the bath water, and you create those bubbles. Basically, foam is any time you take a substance where you can trap air or gas molecules in those bubbles, then you've basically created a foam. And so there's different ways to do that. You could blow that gas into that system, or you could whip it. And so I'm going to give you a couple different demonstrations. So in this case, I just have soap and water and a straw. So I'm going to blow into it. And I've created these bubbles, and basically I'm creating foam with the soap, and obviously the force of the air, like these larger bubbles, means that I put more gas into that part of the soap, those soap molecules, than if I had done it by whipping. And so in this case, I have egg white, and egg whites are actually used in a lot of different strategies for baking. And in this case, basically, what I'm doing is I'm whipping the egg white, and so that's mixing in those gas molecules. And then that actually allows, because of the structure of the egg white molecule, it's also going to be pretty effective in trapping that gas. And this is actually used in a lot of different baking techniques. One, you could use it to make bread, and eggs are often added to gluten-free bread because of these properties. But it's also used a lot when you're making cakes, when you want a nice, big, fluffy cake, if you're making it from scratch. And if you've ever had lemon meringue pie, that white, fluffy stuff on top is also made from egg whites. And I just learned this the other day, which is really cool. Some people don't want to eat any kind of animal products at all, and they follow a vegan diet. And I have a friend she bakes cakes and makes vegan cakes. And I found out the other day that if you pour off the liquid from like garbanzo beans or any other kind of white bean, because the beans have a lot of the starches in them and some of those protein molecules, that gooey, slimy liquid that pours off of this is actually really similar to egg white. And you can whip it up and make meringues just like you would with egg white, only using the garbanzo water. And so I'm actually going to experiment with that in the next few days to see how that turns out with cooking, because I think that's kind of cool. So this foam, if I get this whipped up enough, it'll get really nice hard peaks on it. And if I add sugar, then I could even keep going, and I basically could kind of create divinity and other types of desserts. But if I let this sit right now where it's still kind of a liquid, or if I add other stuff to it, that foam is basically going to kind of collapse, and then it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do. So when you're making bread, obviously we don't just eat the raw dough. I mean, you could. Obviously, a lot of us like to eat cookie dough, and I'm going to get to cookie dough in just a little bit. But the difference with bread dough is you're trying to get those gluten molecules to form that matrix, and then you bake it. And the baking process actually kind of holds and traps that foam structure in place. And the way it does that is because you're removing some. So this is actually a gluten-free loaf that I made, but it actually it removes some of the water from the system. But then it also is this outside part where you're kind of getting this nice hard crust. That's what's helping kind of keep that structure. And then you'll see your air bubbles inside. And gluten-free breads tend to be a little bit more dense. So there's not going to be as large of gas bubbles inside the dough. And it also kind of depends on how wet the dough is when you bake it. But what I have here is I have just some gluten-free flour, and I happen to use buckwheat flour and a little bit of sorghum and some water. And then I also just mixed some yeast, and I have flour and water and yeast in this one. And what I want you to notice is the textures are really different. So if I try to pull up on the yeast dough, those gluten molecules are what's making it nice and gooey, and I can pull it and I can stretch it. And that's basically what's going to make the bread rise and do the things that it does. And even if it's like cake mix or cookies, any kind of baking that you're doing with wheat flour, the gluten is really what's kind of holding it all together. I'm going to rinse my hands so I don't contaminate. Okay, and then in this case, here's my gluten-free flour. It also has some of the stickiness, but you can notice like I can't stretch it. It's not going to make the same kind of structures as the other dough. And so in order to use this dough more effectively, then I have to kind of mix the dough differently, where I kind of would sweep back and forth, and I'm trying to elongate those molecules and kind of align them together. Or the other thing you could do is, so most people who cook with gluten-free options tend to do that because they either have a gluten intolerance or they have an illness. They have a specific disease called celiac, where gluten actually causes major health concerns for them. And some people actually have a hard time breaking down starches, and I actually tend to be one of those people. So I can eat gluten and not have any issues with it. My problem is more of the starches that are in this wheat dough. And so I actually have gluten that I can add to the gluten-free flour, because really what I'm interested in is just not having any of the wheat starch. And if I add the gluten and start mixing it in, it'll actually then start behaving more like the wheat flour dough, because it's going to have, that's the molecule that's actually going to cause it to be more stretchy. So just need a little bit more water. Okay, and again, as you mix it, those gluten molecules, once they start sticking together and they form that matrix, and now you can see that my dough has much more of those stretchy properties that I was looking for with the wheat flour. It's still not going to be quite as good, and part of that is figuring out my water ratio to the flour, and also figuring out exactly how much gluten I need to add. But it's definitely going to help it bake differently than if I had not used any of it at all. And if I don't want to use the gluten, that's where the egg comes in. So using egg or other starches that are really, really sticky, like cornstarch or tapioca, those are also good substitutes, and a lot of people will use that with their baking as well. Okay, so once you get your bread and you have this nice foam, then the next thing you want to do, obviously, is eat it. And the other really cool science thing about bread that I want to talk about today is actually what happens when you toast bread, and what is that browning that's happening. And so I'm going to show you a slide again. And this is called the Maillard reaction. And basically what this is that there are enzymes, which are special kinds of proteins. So one way to think about an enzyme is almost like a pair of chemical scissors, or a mixing tool. So enzymes help speed up reactions, and enzymes can be found everywhere. And even in your saliva in your mouth, when you eat the bread or that cookie or that piece of cake, you have enzymes in your saliva that actually break the starches down into sugars to help your body access that sugar even quicker for your energy production. And so there's a special kind of enzyme that basically is involved with the browning of food when we cook food. So when you think about bacon, and it also is very aromatic, meaning that it's producing smells. So when we toast bread and you smell that toasting, when you cook meat and you see the browning of the meat and you smell those smells that you're smelling are all kind of a result of this chemical reaction that's happening, where these enzymes are basically, and they're oxidizing, or they're helping break down other structures on the surface of that food. And that's what's causing the color change, and it's also causing the smell. So you know that a chemical reaction is happening if you see a color change, obviously if you see a gas production, if a new substance is being created. So when you cook food, you are literally doing chemistry. And so the Maillard reaction is actually a really awesome one, because that's what makes bread even taste better when you're going to toast it and put all those, the toppings that you want to put on your bread. And so I'm going to toast a piece of bread, because I actually haven't had breakfast yet. And I'm getting really hungry talking about all this food. And so, and some people obviously argue about how much toasting you should have on your bread, or if you think about your family members or friends who want to, I'm going to leave my presentation now.
Say, Bree, hi.
Yeah.
We were having some comments. Hello, everybody out there, by the way. We were having some comments that the screen wasn't shared. So we were not able to see the presentation. I just thought we'd let you know that we'll put it up. We'll get a link to it, and we'll put it up in the chat afterwards. Okay. I don't know if you have it right handy, but apparently there's some technical difficulties there. So, but anyway, I don't want to interrupt. I just wanted to jump in and say hi to everybody, and to let everybody know we're aware that there's a thing with the presentation, and go back to toasting your bread, because that sounds really good.
Okay, well, no problem. There's only like 3 or 4 slides on there anywhere, and they're just visual images. So we'll make sure those get shared so people can see the diagrams of the molecules. So basically, when we bake bread too, that Maillard reaction is happening. Obviously, that's this browning that happens on the outside of the bread. And this is something that I've been experimenting with, because one of the things I learned recently is that if you add water to your oven while you're cooking the bread, you can actually kind of make sure that it doesn't dry out. And then you also get more of this nice browning on the outside. And I actually kind of like that. And I think the crust is the best part of the bread. Some people don't like the crust. I also think the crust on the pizza is the best part of the pizza. But now this got a little too brown. And then obviously that makes it hard. And so I have to like cover this afterwards and let kind of as the water, I put tinfoil over it, and then the water condenses and it kind of softens the outside. And so the other thing I've heard of is actually baking the bread then in a covered container, where like a Dutch oven or something, where you can kind of help even trap more of that moisture so that doesn't happen. And it's kind of like when you cook a turkey for Thanksgiving, right? You start out with the bird being kind of covered, because you don't want the outside to burn while the inside's cooking. And then near the end, you take off that foil. Oh, my toast just popped. You take off that foil so that you can kind of brown the skin on the outside. And again, that is the Maillard reaction. So every time you eat food now, you're probably going to be thinking about that. And you can impress your family members by talking about the Maillard reaction. You can Google that. It's Maillard. And there's even videos out there about it, and thinking about all the different things that make food delicious because of chemistry and because of enzymes and what they're doing. And so I am going to leave you now and go eat my toast. And if there are any other questions or comments in the chat, we'll make sure that we answer those. And I would encourage you to go and experiment with some of these things. For example, let's see, let me grab. I don't know if it's because I live a mile up in elevation in Lead, South Dakota, but for some reason, ever since I moved to South Dakota, I can't make cookies to save my life. They spread out and they don't work, and I've tried everything. Is it the butter? Is it how much water I have in there? Do I need more flour? Every kind of experiment you can think of, and it just fails every time. And then I saw somebody made cookies with cake mix. It's a thing, and it's amazing. So normally when you make cake and you just do it with the box, you're supposed to always add a half a cup of oil and a cup of water and 3 eggs. That's kind of the standard ratios of things that you put together to make the cake. And that makes the cake. And then remember, the eggs are involved with that rising. And there's also baking soda and baking powder in here, which are going to be part of that process of helping trap the gases. But if you only add the eggs and use one less egg, so just use 2 eggs and just the oil, it actually comes out more like a cookie. So it comes out much more dense. It doesn't bake up and get nice and fluffy like a cake. It's actually a cookie. And the dough is also going to be thicker like cookie dough. And so this is like my new favorite thing, because you can buy a plain box of cake mix and you can add any kind of flavorings or seasonings you want and kind of make your own cookies and not feel like a total failure in the kitchen because they completely collapse on you and spread out all over the cookie sheet. So anyway, I just thought that was really cool. And so you can do additional experiments with foam and cooking by just using cake mixes too, and playing around with the ratios of the things that you're adding to it to see what happens. Like think about a brownie versus a chocolate cake versus a chocolate cookie. Each of those is a foam, but because of the ratios of the things, the chemicals you're adding and how those molecules are creating a solution and a mixture, and then how they're supporting the trapping of those gases, you're going to end up with a different structure at the end when it's baked. And I'm going to just check real quick to see if there's any other questions or comments. And I don't see anything. So happy cooking and eating, and we will see you soon.